Good evening once again. So my second speech couldn't be more different from the first, and it's about Scottish weddings. So a couple of words or expressions. So a stately home, attire, kilts, the Jacobite rebellion, tying the knot, hand-fastening, quaich, piper, and bagpipes. And I will now begin my speech. Dearest colleagues, I recently came back from a trip to Scotland, where I'm from, and there are a number of reasons why I go back to Scotland. And it seems that in recent years, the most common reason has been to go back for weddings of friends and family. Now, while weddings did take quite the hit during COVID, many of my friends and family had to postpone their weddings. They had to reduce the number of people that were invited, or very often guests couldn't go because they were self-isolating. And in fact, that happened to me not 2 months ago. But it does seem now that things are back on track. Therefore, I thought that since I was at a wedding at the weekend in Scotland, I would talk about it in my speech and mention a few of the different traditions that you might encounter. So firstly, it's worth mentioning that the wedding at the weekend didn't exactly follow all of the conventional norms. In fact, there were only 18 people at the wedding. Well, if you include the dog, there were 19 in total. It took place at a very large stately home in the north of Scotland, just south of Inverness. And the couple, the newlyweds-to-be, had rented out this big house to hold the wedding and to house us over the weekend. It was a civil ceremony, meaning that it wasn't religious, and it was conducted then by what we call a celebrant. And it was a celebrant from the local council. Now, while the couple didn't follow all of the kind of traditional, conventional rituals, there were some that were present, and those are the ones I'm going to talk about today. So, firstly, the dress code. Much like in other weddings, the dress code was formal attire, and you're probably wondering if at the Scottish wedding people were wearing kilts, and the answer would be yes and no. So in Scotland, kilts are worn on special occasions, on celebrations, and very often at weddings, you will see people with kilts and other people wearing suits. And so in this case, for example, the groom and the best man were wearing kilts, but I unfortunately was not wearing a kilt, so I can't show you any photos of that. And ironically, the other two people wearing kilts were the father of the bride, who's Italian, and another guest who was from Switzerland. While there seems to be quite a lot of romanticism around wearing kilts, it was only in the 19th century that kilts began to be worn for these kinds of occasions. An older version of what would have been the modern day kilt was actually outlawed in Scotland in 1746, just after the final Jacobite rebellion, when it was crushed by the British throne. But the reason that it survived is because the only people that were allowed to wear the kilt were soldiers in the Highland Regiment. So the next tradition that I'm going to talk about are the rings. So in this case, they did exchange rings, the bride and groom. And according to the celebrant of the wedding, the ring is a symbol of the commitment that the couple is entering into. And since it is continuous, it's much like the commitment, which in theory never ends. The third tradition then is, well, I've talked about rings, and while that's quite commonplace, this third tradition is maybe not so commonplace outside of Scotland. The couples on the wedding day tied the knot. Now, you might know the expression to tie the knot, which means to get married, but in Scotland, couples often literally tie the knot. So what happens is that during the ceremony, the bride and the groom bring a strip of cloth. Now, this can be anything. It can be rope, it can be a scarf, it can even be a dog's lead. The celebrant then positions this piece of cloth over the hands of the bride and the groom, and with some maneuvering and some manipulation, they pull their hands apart and they form a knot with the cloth. So this is called the hand-fastening ritual. And in fact, it's actually been around for centuries in Scotland. And it seems that that is the origin of the expression to tie the knot. The final tradition that I'm going to talk about is one that's often involves a gift. So in this case, it happened during the speeches at dinner, and it was the best man who gave this gift, and that was a quaich. So a quaich is a two-handled, typically silver dish, and what normally happens is that it is filled with whiskey, and the bride and the groom drink from it as a way of sealing the marriage. So the whiskey is obviously optional, but what is symbolic is that there are two handles. So to end, I would say that there are lots of traditions at weddings, different rituals. For example, in Scotland, in a bigger wedding, you would normally have a piper playing the bagpipes as the couple leaves the church. You would also have a first dance, you would have the cutting of the cake and so on. And while this wedding didn't have all of those different traditions, I hope that I have managed to convince you that if given the chance, you should go to a Scottish wedding. Thank you.